Okay, now let's talk about human sexuality and reproduction. Reminder, sexes, saying male or female, or the sexes, refers to biology. Gender refers to social presentation and perception. There are also individuals whose genetic identity, biological identity by either gametes or genitalia, and social identity do not line up. This happens in humans and in other species. These other genders persist despite the lower likelihood of reproducing and despite social pressures to conform. In other times and in other places, cultures may perceive more than two genders, and sexual orientation is often more fluid than it seems to be in Western culture today. So I do want to talk about sexuality. Homosexuality is a complex trait. It is multifactorial. We know there's a genetic component, and there seems to be a social component. Exposure to who knows what. And I say who knows what because we really don't know exactly what it is. Most people know their sexual identity and gender identity when they are very, very young. By the time kids go to kindergarten, they know their gender identity, and a lot of them know their sexual orientation before puberty or at the very beginning of puberty. When we look at America, approximately 5% of Americans openly identify as somewhere on the LGBTQIA spectrum. There's a lot of letters there. There's a lot of diversity in this non-heterosexual camp. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual. So there are all of these different categories of human sexuality, and they are all normal. Now, I mentioned a lot of cultures, their sexual orientation is more fluid than what we see in modern times, and not all cultures recognize homosexuality. In modern times, many cultures are violently opposed to LGBTQIA individuals. And so they say that it's an illness or a disease or it can be cured. Yep, none of that is true. However, if we go back in ancient times, many cultures accepted behaviors that modern people would consider homosexual, and they were considered normal. And we see things like it's okay to have homosexual relationships before you're married, but when you're married, it's heterosexual. Or heterosexual within marriage, but lovers of the same sex are okay. These rules usually apply to males more than females. Females often did not have the same freedoms as males. But it's very, very hard to study LGBTQIA in most societies and in most times. Sexual behavior is considered private, and if that behavior is shunned by society, it will usually go on in secret, but it won't be discussed and it won't be recorded. Not to mention what we consider homosexuality today, other cultures don't. And to make matters worse, older written documentation about things can sometimes be rewritten or reanalyzed to support more recent society viewpoints. But think about this. In cultures where, for example, homosexuality is punished by things like shunning or even death, it still goes on. It is a biological drive. And asking people to change that is like asking people to change how tall they are. It can't be done. And for those who say it's not natural, well, homosexuality in animals is pretty common. It's used for social bonding, for pleasure, for dominance displays. It's even used for pairing up to raise young. The Laysan albatross, a lot of the couples in the albatross society are female-female couples. Males tend to die more often than females due to the way they interact with, sadly, fishing equipment, which causes them to die. So the females will get together and one female will mate with a nearby male and come back, and the two females will raise the chick of that female whose egg was fertilized, because it takes two adults to raise one chick. So it's natural, and let me be completely clear, as long as everybody is consenting, whatever is fine. Now, gender identity. We talk about people who are trans, which means that the gender they were assigned at birth doesn't match up with their gender identity. Trans means opposite or different. Those who are lucky enough where their gender assigned at birth matches with their genes and their gametes and their genitalia and their gender identity are called cis. Cis meaning the same, C-I-S. Gender identity is usually determined by age 3. And it is very, very poorly understood. Not all cultures have two genders. There's one modern culture where there's a pretty strong difference between male and female roles in society. Some women will dress and behave like a male, work a job that's considered a male job, and that is considered a third gender. And this woman can marry a feminine woman, and they would not be considered lesbians. All right, so that is your human sexuality part of the lecture. Now we're going to talk about reproduction. Reproduction, the production of a new human, requires sperm, requires egg. At this point, we are not able to clone humans. There has been a claim of genetic manipulation of a fertilized egg. Was it real? Maybe. We can certainly manipulate the odds of whether you're going to have a male or female before fertilization. That's, last I checked, illegal in the United States. So fertilization is when a sperm enters the oocyte, or the egg. Oocyte is the scientific word for egg. It takes multiple sperm for a successful fertilization event. There's this protective layer around the egg. And each sperm has some enzymes that will help break down that protective layer so the sperm can get into the egg. But one sperm doesn't have enough of that enzyme, so it takes multiple sperms. Sperm that have a Y chromosome as opposed to an X chromosome are slightly faster. So you end up with 51% of births producing a male offspring. Now, males are more likely to die younger, so it evens out for the reproductive years, roughly. It is estimated that over half of all fertilization events, where a sperm fertilizes an egg, fails before the pregnancy. So no matter what you might hear, fertilization is not the same thing as a pregnancy. So what is pregnancy? Pregnancy begins when a fertilized egg implants in the uterine wall, the wall of the uterus. And this is at least 8 to 10 days after fertilization. So what happens? In the middle of the picture, we see the ovary. During ovulation, an oocyte or egg is released into this tube called the fallopian tube. It gets fertilized, assuming sperm is around and everything's going well. We call that day 0. And then it starts to divide, becomes a ball, becomes a more hollow ball, and day 8 or 9 implants in the uterus. 50% or more of fertilizations do not implant. 10 to 20% of implantations will result in a miscarriage. This is very common if there are chromosomal abnormalities, but implantation is the beginning of the pregnancy. Now, because it can be hard to figure out exactly when implantation occurred, we calculate pregnancy starting from the last menstrual period. So when we say 40 weeks of pregnancy, that's not 40 weeks of being pregnant. That's calculated from the last menstrual period. So there's a couple of weeks there where they'll count that as part of the pregnancy, but the woman is not really pregnant. There's no implantation. So pregnancy lasts 40 weeks. Between 37 and 41 weeks is considered full term. Viability starts around 22 weeks. So a little more than halfway through the pregnancy. Survival is very, very low at this point. Healthy children who survive are pretty rare. When we get to 24 weeks, survival reaches 50%. And that is when medical care is often, there's a lot of medical care put into helping these individuals survive. They're still preterm. They can have long-term physical and mental challenges, which can last a lifetime. Some of them will be healthy. It's hard to predict which ones are which. So during pregnancy, that fertilized egg, which is called a zygote, goes through a bunch of changes. We call this development. This is the development of a zygote up to 2 months, about 8 weeks. At 12 weeks, a fetus is about 2 inches long. It would fit in your hand. At 22 weeks, a fetus is about 11 inches long. So there's quite a lot of growing, but it's still small compared to a full term, which would be 18 to 24 inches. Now, there's a lot of bad information about the process of development out there, primarily by groups that are opposed to abortion. First off, there is not a beating heart at 24 hours after fertilization or whatever they're saying. A fully formed heart takes longer to develop. A circulatory system takes longer to develop than they're claiming. And besides that, a heartbeat doesn't make a live individual. I can create the equivalent of a beating heart in a petri dish. In my viewpoint, it's the nervous system that makes the individual. And a fully functional nervous system really begins in the last trimester, somewhere between 27 or 28 weeks. Wow, that's pretty far. Before 27 weeks, the nervous system is not developed enough for the fetus to feel pain. Think about that one. The heartbeat, I mentioned heart beating a minute ago, really doesn't begin until about 6 weeks. And even then, the circulatory system isn't complete. Okay. When we think about abortion, it's a very controversial and often very emotional discussion. But it is important to realize that sometimes a fetus or an embryo is not viable, will not survive after or through the length of the pregnancy or after birth. Or the pregnancy occurred in the fallopian tube instead of in the uterus. That is not a survivable process for the fetus or the mother. These are important things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the issue. All right. Fertility. Women are fertile about 5 days out of the month. So there's this little window of time where the egg is in the right part of the fallopian tube and the sperm are viable because they can fertilize an egg. It doesn't have to be right at the sex event. It's usually a few days after that fertilization occurs. The average couple takes about 3 months of trying to conceive, to get a pregnancy. 80% of couples in their 30s can conceive within a year without assistance. But fertility does decline with age. And with age, the risk of birth defects increases. With older fathers, there's an increased risk the offspring will have autism, epilepsy, schizophrenia, and cancer. With older mothers, there's a higher risk of Down syndrome and miscarriage. And if you don't want to get pregnant, let's talk about birth control. Hormonal birth control is the most effective process. Implants, pills, patches, shots, these prevent production of an oocyte or an egg. So no egg is produced, no fertilization happens, no fertilization, no pregnancy. This includes the morning after pills. So if you have a sexual encounter and the condom breaks and you go to the drugstore and you get morning after pills, that prevents release of an egg from the ovary. No fertilization will happen. So hormonal systems vary in efficacy, but they are generally in the 90% range. And some of them, like the implant, like surgical sterilization, vasectomies or tubal ligations, and the IUD are 99% effective. Physical barriers are less effective, and it varies depending on the method and how consistently the method is used. So condoms are around 80% effective. While hormonal methods prevent pregnancy at higher rates, they do not prevent sexually transmitted infections. And they can have side effects. Some of them are good, such as lighter, less frequent periods, or even no periods. And it's okay to not have a period if you are on birth control. After the age of 40, hormonal methods do increase the risk of blood clots, which is a serious concern. Condoms, less effective, but prevents transmission of most sexually transmitted infections, except for HPV, human papillomavirus. But there's a vaccine for human papillomavirus, and studies are already showing that women who received the HPV vaccine when they were teenagers are 80% less likely to develop cervical cancer. Now, that group is still relatively young, but we expect that value to continue. And then, of course, when we look at this, we look at the bottom level, and there are things like fertility awareness and withdrawal, which is not really that effective and not much different than just crossing your fingers and hoping. And the bad news, you don't even have to have penetration for a pregnancy to occur if sperm gets transferred to the vagina by some other method. Okay, so there's your sex talk. Hopefully you learned something, and that's going to wrap up this lecture.